At first light, beneath a veil of Arlington mist that held close to the ground like breath over cold glass, Sergeant Grant Volkov moved in perfect ritual cadence before the tomb, his boots striking stone with crisp, measured clicks that carried farther than conversation ever could, farther than traffic, farther than morning birds, until the sound itself became command. 21 steps. Pause, turn, repeat. The marble held the pale sun and returned it in softened glare, white against white, tomb against headstones, each surface clean as oath language, each edge so exact it seemed less constructed than consecrated. Rows of markers descended the hills in disciplined geometry, a silent formation stretching beyond sightline. And in that hour, the whole cemetery looked less like landscape than memory arranged at attention. Volkov crossed his lane again, M14 steady against his shoulder, chin level, gaze fixed on a point only he could see, expression sealed into the mask that had become second nature long before he had ever earned a tomb guard badge. The crowd gathered in the hush that always came when ritual outlasted curiosity. Veterans stood with hands folded behind their backs, old habits refusing retirement. A man in a faded Marine cap leaned into a polished cane but did not sit. A woman with silver hair, black coat, and a folded program clutched to her chest watched without blinking, as if she feared to miss a single step. Two school groups from opposite sides of the country stood shoulder to shoulder along the rope line. Phones that had entered the plaza raised for snapshots now hung forgotten at knees, their screens dark, their owners suddenly aware that some places did not permit spectatorship without consequence. A father adjusted a blanket over the legs of his daughter in a wheelchair. A young soldier in civilian clothes, left sleeve pinned flat where an arm no longer filled it, removed his baseball cap and held it against his heart. No one announced silence. Silence arrived because the rhythm demanded it. Volkov turned again at the end of the mat. His uniform was immaculate in a way that did not invite admiration so much as accountability. Every crease lay sharp enough to cut glass. Brass caught the dawn in hard points of light. White gloves remained pristine despite humidity that would have softened lesser discipline. His kepi sat at exact angle, lined true to brow, and his boots were polished to a mirror sheen that reflected the pale sky in miniature with every step. To the untrained eye, he appeared ceremonial, carved from procedure and precision, the polished surface of military tradition displayed for tourists and schoolchildren. What the crowd saw was stillness in motion. Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive. What no one in that moment could see was the internal calculus moving beneath it. Volkov tracked wind by the feel against his left cheek and adjusted pace pressure without a visible break in form. He counted not only steps, but intervals, crowd density shifts at the railing, stroller wheel lock points, distance from nearest medic station, entry patterns at the lower walkway, posture changes in visitors who looked unsteady. He noted a boy in an oversized hoodie, leaning too far forward, and in the next pass he noted the boy's mother close the gap and steady him by the shoulder. He registered a veteran with tremor in his right hand, and one cycle later saw the tremor settle when the veteran braced his thumb in his palm. His training had taught him that vigilance was not theatrical awareness. It was disciplined absorption of details before they became problems. At the tomb, that vigilance had to be absolute because the place did not belong to him. It belonged to the fallen, and he served by denying himself the luxury of distraction. By the first week of October, the morning air at Arlington carried that narrow, honest cold that sharpened breath and thought together. A grounds crew cart moved at walking speed on a far lane, tires whispering over damp pavement. Flag lines answered the wind in restrained snaps. Somewhere down the slope, a bus door sighed open, then shut, then opened again as another set of visitors unloaded. The ordinary mechanics of a national cemetery continued at the perimeter. But around the tomb, those sounds dimmed as if respectful distance were acoustical law. Even children sensed it. A little girl near the center rope line asked her grandfather a question in a whisper so soft he had to bend to hear it. He answered by touching 2 fingers to the brim of his cap and nodding toward Volkov's measured turn. The child nodded back with solemn concentration and stood straighter. At the rear of the viewing area, 9-year-old Rosie Pike sat in a wheelchair with a navy blanket over her knees and a patch clenched carefully in both hands, as if cloth could be fragile and heavy at once. The patch had weathered edges, and a stitched insignia rubbed smooth at one corner from repeated handling. She held it at chest level, eyes moving in sync with Volkov's path, counting under her breath with the seriousness children reserve for tasks they believe might matter to adults. Her mother stood just behind her, fingers resting on the wheelchair handles, chin tucked against wind and grief alike. Neither spoke. They did not need to. They had come for rhythm, and rhythm was there. Volkov reached the 21st step, halted, executed the turn, and resumed. His face remained unreadable, carved from discipline, but behind that stillness memory existed in clear compartments, each one sealed and catalogued so he could serve without fracture. He had learned to build those compartments in dust-blown valleys overseas, in vehicle convoys under uncertain skies, in briefings that ended with coordinates and return windows and names that sometimes came back on folded flags. The tomb did not erase any of that. It gave it order. Each pass across the mat was an argument against forgetfulness. Each pause was acknowledgement, not performance. The crowd shifted as more visitors arrived along the lower approach. A group of high school athletes in matching jackets removed gum from their mouths and folded wrappers into pockets without being told. A retired Army nurse with bronze service pins on her coat clasped her hands and watched with a gaze that held equal parts pride and ache. A pair of tourists speaking another language fell quiet as soon as they reached the rope, and with unmistakable instinct removed their hats. The ceremony translated without subtitles. A ranger at the side entrance made eye contact with another staff member and tapped 2 fingers against a radio earpiece, then returned to stillness. The gesture was small, procedural, and easily missed. Volkov did not miss it. He logged it and continued. 30 seconds later, the ranger repeated the touch, listened, nodded once, and set his jaw. No alarm sounded. No one ran. Yet a subtle current passed through perimeter staff, the kind that preceded rerouted foot traffic or a medical call in heavy crowds. Volkov registered the change in peripheral cues alone. One volunteer repositioning a stanchion by 6 inches, another directing arrivals to a neighboring lane with calm insistence. He marched on. The tomb remained the axis. Mist thinned as sunlight climbed, revealing more of the slope and more of the gathered witnesses. A husband lifted his wife's oxygen line to keep it clear as she stood. A teenager with dyed blue hair took off a beanie and held it to his chest with both hands, eyes fixed forward. 2 middle-aged men, strangers by clothing and posture, recognized each other's unit pins and exchanged no words at all, only a brief nod that said enough. Volkov passed before them, rifle upright, shoulders squared, stride exact, and every one of them followed his movement, with the reverence reserved for a standard in battle or a casket at graveside. The sacred and the ordinary met there every morning. Camera shutters, cane tips, polished brass, damp leaves, quiet coughs into sleeves, the low rumble of city life beyond the gates. All of it gathered and then bent, willingly, around one uncompromising ritual maintained by one soldier, in full view of a nation that too often remembered sacrifice only on holidays. At the tomb, remembrance was not seasonal. It was daily labor. Volkov reached the turnpoint again and pivoted, precise as metronome steel. Near the rear walkway, a civilian contractor in a dark suit arrived at a brisk pace and stopped short when a staff sergeant on site asked for identification. The man produced a badge wallet, spoke quickly, gestured once toward the transit gate beyond the trees, and checked a watch that probably cost more than some visitor's monthly rent. The staff sergeant did not yield space. He listened, gave one clipped reply, and pointed toward the operations office instead of the plaza. The suited man's jaw tightened. He forced a smile that never touched his eyes, turned away, and strode downhill with the urgency of someone accustomed to getting his way on schedule. Volkov did not glance toward him. Protocol held. Step by step, he continued the watch. By 700 hours, the mist had fully lifted, and the marble gleamed under clean autumn light as if polished from within. The crowd remained uncovered, motionless, drawn into the gravity of the place and the sentinel who carried that gravity without a word. Rosie Pike shifted the patch in her lap, took a steadying breath, and resumed counting with him. Along the rope line, the old Marine tightened his grip on the cane and whispered, almost to himself, "That's how you keep faith." Volkov's boots clicked over stone again, unbroken, unwavering, each strike a promise made in public and kept in private, while beyond the trees, at the visitor transit gate, a different kind of urgency began to gather shape. Beyond the trees, the visitor transit gate had turned from orderly queue to pressure point in less than 2 minutes, and the first warning sign was not noise but shape. Bodies packed too tightly in rising morning heat, wheelchairs stalled at the curb cut, strollers pinned sideways against temporary barricades while a funeral shuttle idled at an angle with its rear door open and one handler kneeling in the lane with an empty lid in his fist. Atlas lay 10 yards beyond that handler, chest low to pavement, head raised, eyes fixed up the axis toward the tomb, as if the marble itself were speaking in a language only he still trusted. His coat was dusted with grit from where he had dragged himself under one rail and around another. His flanks rose hard and fast. He ignored the bowl of water beside him, ignored the hand extended by a medic, ignored a chunk of ration bar held out by an airport-style security volunteer. When Rosie Pike's mother reached the barricade with the unit patch in hand, he gave one slow thump of tail and did not move. "Second day," one transit officer whispered into his mic, sweat tracing down his neck despite the breeze, still refusing transfer. A black SUV braked hard at the service lane. Nolan Price stepped out before the driver had finished parking. He wore a charcoal suit that fit like armor built by invoice, polished shoes untouched by dirt, and mirrored cufflinks that flashed when he checked his watch and started forward. A laminated federal contractor credential bounced against his chest as he pushed past a park employee and slapped the top rail with an open palm. "What is this circus?" he snapped. "Convoy route is in 18 minutes. The park employee pointed toward Atlas with cautious care, as if volume might shatter whatever held the dog steady. "Sir, this is a morning case. Arlington Command is reviewing—" "I didn't ask for a case file." Price swung toward the tranquilizer specialist standing by a white utility van. "You, clear it." The specialist hesitated. "We need a veterinary sign-off and line-of-fire clearance. There are kids on the rail." Price's smile thinned into contempt. It's a dog in a traffic lane. We are not delaying diplomatic movement for a photo op vigil. A murmur moved through the crowd, low and tight. The old Marine from the rope line had followed with his cane and stood rigid near the barricade, jaw set. The Gold Star mother clutched her folded program so hard the paper bowed. High schoolers who had looked uncertain at first now stood shoulder to shoulder, phones lowered, faces drawn. Rosie sat in her wheelchair at the front gap where staff had made room, blanket bunched in her fists, eyes locked on Atlas, as if sheer attention could keep him breathing evenly. Price saw Volkov only when the sentinel approached from the upper walkway under escort by a staff sergeant from Arlington Operations, formally relieved from Tomb Watch and temporarily reassigned to Gate 2 pending command direction. Even off the mat, in full ceremonial uniform, Grant Volkov moved with the same measured economy. No wasted motion, no hurry visible, no surrender of bearing. His brass still caught the light. His gloves were still white. His face remained carved from discipline as he halted at the inner barrier and took in the lane in one sweep. Dog, child, dart angle, crowd compression, heat shimmer, emergency egress. Price looked him over and dismissed him in a heartbeat. "Good," Price said. "Parade boys here. Move this mutt." The words landed like a strike across stone. The crowd froze. Even the handler in the lane went still, lead strap hanging loose from his hand. What Nolan Price did not know sat beneath Volkov's silence like steel beneath polished wood. Before Arlington, before the tomb badge, before the immaculate cadence on marble, Volkov had run K-9 tactical support on 2 Afghanistan rotations and 1 Syria deployment, reading K-9 stress shifts in dust storms, under rotor wash, under fire, in alleys where a wrong signal cost lives. He had learned how ears flatten before panic, how breathing cadence telegraphs, neurological overload, how a working dog in grief could hold mission focus longer than most men could hold posture. To Price, Volkov was decorative authority in perfect cloth. In truth, he was a combat veteran, trained to see what everyone else missed. And Atlas was not obstructing traffic. Atlas was standing watch in the only posture grief had left him. Price jabbed a finger toward the tranquilizer specialist. 30-second countdown. Execute on my mark. The specialist raised the dart gun, but did not shoulder it yet. "Sir, I need the lane cleared first." "Then clear it." The staff sergeant beside Volkov spoke with clipped control. "Mr. Price, Arlington Command has not authorized chemical restraint." Price flashed his credential. "I am lead crisis manager for Federal Transit Operations. My authority supersedes local ceremony concerns when route integrity is compromised." A veteran nurse in the crowd answered before anyone else could. "He said ceremony. Listen to him." Price ignored her and took one step closer to the rail. Atlas's ears flattened tighter against his skull. His breath shortened. His paws flexed against pavement in rapid, shallow pushes that never translated into movement. Rosie's voice broke small and sharp through the heat. "Don't shoot him." No one around her had language big enough for that moment. They had only posture, breath, and the sound of a contractor counting seconds toward a decision he did not understand. "Before we dive into this story, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that values like honor, courage, and sacrifice still matter, join us in keeping their legacy alive." The pause did not diffuse anything. It tightened everything. By 7:08, the autumn cool that had wrapped the tomb at first light had burned off at the transit concrete, and heat lifted from the lane in wavering sheets that made distance hard to trust. The barricades formed a funnel with no elegant exits. Families clustered to one side, service carts trapped behind a locked gate. 2 military police units, still 2 minutes out, according to the radio clipped to the staff sergeant's vest. Volkov read the geometry with the same ruthless calm he had once used to read compounds and alley mouths overseas. Outwardly, he looked unchanged. Internally, he had already run 3 nonverbal de-escalation options and discarded 2. Atlas shifted his weight half an inch and stopped, eyes never leaving the uphill line toward the tomb. The dog's focus was not random fixation. It was orientation. He had chosen an axis and anchored to it. Volkov recognized the pattern because he had seen versions of it in retired working dogs after handler loss. Self-assigned watch position, refusal to abandon perceived duty station, selective acceptance of touch from one bonded family member. In that state, a dart could trigger panic sprint, cardiac strain, defensive snap, or full collapse. Price heard only schedule. Volkov heard physiology and memory colliding. The staff sergeant lowered his voice toward Volkov without taking his gaze off Price. "Can you calm him?" Volkov answered with one measured sentence. "Yes, if no one escalates." Price caught the word and barked a humorless laugh. "Escalates? He's a dog." "He is a military partner in distress," Volkov said. Price turned, incredulous. "You don't brief me on terminology. You stand where I tell you and keep civilians behind rail." A small movement at the barricade drew Volkov's peripheral attention. Rosie had lifted her father's unit patch and pressed it to the top rail with both hands, as if presenting credentials to the animal who already knew them by scent and story. Her mother leaned close, speaking to her in a whisper too soft for others to hear, then looked up at Volkov with the expression of someone asking permission and forgiveness at the same time. The old Marine beside them straightened, one knuckle white around his cane. 2 schoolboys, who could not have been older than 14, took a step back to widen space around the wheelchair without being asked. The crowd was learning formation in real time. A dispatcher's voice snapped through the staff radios in clipped bursts for arriving command. Not a summary, but a running incident log. Gate 2. Confirmed subject Atlas arrived on honor transport for Staff Sergeant Owen Pike Memorial. Remained controlled through observance, folded flag transfer, and taps. During loading transition, subject slipped harness. When child Rosie Pike cried out, moved direct toward tomb approach, then re-established same orientation point after each relocation attempt. Repeat. Non-aggressive, fixed duty posture, bereavement protocol active, hydration interventions logged, exception review open in operations binder. The ranger nearest the rail relayed the final line aloud without looking at Price. "All units, do not force movement pending command." At 0710, a park ranger finally reached the front rail with a printed incident sheet tucked under his arm, breath controlled but quick. "Mr. Price, this is now documented as active bereavement support pending command determination. You cannot authorize sedation solo." Price did not take the paper. "Watch me." The tranquilizer specialist swallowed hard, dart gun angled low. "Sir, I need a clear order in writing." "You have me on body cam giving it verbally. That's enough." "No, sir, it isn't." Price stepped into the specialist's space and hissed through his teeth. "If that convoy reroutes because of this circus, your company bill takes the hit, not mine." Volkov watched the exchange and tracked Atlas's respiration at the edge of his vision. 4 rapid pulls. Pause. 3 rapid pulls. Microtremor in the right foreleg. Stress climbing. He shifted his own stance 1 degree left to block a potential dart lane to the dog's shoulder if the specialist buckled under pressure. White glove at his side, jaw set, breathing slow. Every instinct from combat told him that waiting was sometimes action, when timing was the only weapon that kept everyone intact. The staff sergeant touched his radio. "Ops, this is Gate 2. Contractor attempting unauthorized sedation. Request immediate command presence." Static answered, then a crisp female voice from dispatch. "Command en route. Hold status. Repeat. Hold status." Price heard that too and looked past the sergeant, straight at Volkov, deciding where to place his next shove. "You," he said. "Move him now, parade boy, or I'll have you pulled for interference." Volkov's eyes did not leave Atlas. "Negative." The word was calm, formal, final. A ripple ran through the witnesses like current through wire. The Gold Star mother closed her eyes for one heartbeat and opened them again, shoulders squared. The young amputee soldier at the back removed his cap and held it at his chest. A tourist father lifted his child from the stroller and turned her so she could see the dog and the guard together, not as spectacle, but as instruction. Rosie reached one hand through the lower gap in the barricade, fingers spread, palm trembling in open air. At 0711, sirens approached from the service road, muted but closing. Price checked his watch again, then the road, then the cameras mounted above the gate, calculating consequences by optics and contract language. He had entered the morning convinced authority came from access badges and countdowns. He now stood in a lane where authority was being measured by who understood sacrifice and who treated it as obstruction. The distinction was no longer subtle. Volkov took one controlled breath and set his weight through both boots, ready to move if the dart came up, ready to hold if command arrived first, ready to absorb the cost of whichever choice preserved the child, the dog, and the dignity of the dead whose names were spoken in this place with care. The specialist lifted the dart gun to shoulder height, uncertain hands trying to look steady, and the countdown began again. The barrel came up, but the shot did not. A gust cut through the transit lane from the open rise below the amphitheater, carrying cool leaves and diesel exhaust in the same breath, and for one suspended beat, the whole gate stood inside a hard-edged stillness that felt as disciplined as parade drill and as fragile as glass. Arlington's upper slopes shone in clean autumn light beyond the trees, rows of white markers climbing and falling, with the earth like silent ranks on permanent review. Down at Gate 2, the concrete radiated a trapped warmth. Metal barricades smelled faintly of sun-heated paint, and the idling shuttle coughed once, then settled into a low mechanical hum that underlined every voice. Volkov did not move. His ceremonial coat sat across his shoulders, as if tailored onto stone, dark fabric pulled flat without a ripple, brass buttons aligned with geometric exactness from throat to belt, each one reflecting slivers of sky and crowd in warped gold. The line of his trousers remained knife-sharp despite the heat. His white gloves, still unmarked, held a brightness that seemed almost defiant against asphalt dust. The kepi was set to regulation angle, brim shadowing unreadable eyes that missed nothing, dart muzzle drift, Atlas's ribcage rhythm, Rosie's shaking hand under the lower rail, the slight inward lean of the old Marine bracing to intervene if anyone failed the moment. The M14 was not in his hands now, but his bearing carried the same message it carried on the mat. Discipline was not location-dependent. Duty traveled with him. To the left of the lane, the Gold Star mother stood with her folded program against her sternum, as though she were keeping her own pulse from breaking loose. Her knuckles had gone pale around the paper. Beside her, the retired army nurse with bronze pins at her collar had shifted from observer to witness, feet planted shoulder-width, posture erect, chin lifted toward the specialist with a look that made clear she would testify to anything she saw. Two high school boys in team jackets who had arrived earlier with slouched uncertainty now stood with their backs straight and mouths shut, one resting a steadying hand on the other's shoulder, when the countdown reached single digits. A tourist couple with accents from far away held their hats over their hearts and remained utterly silent, their young son pressed between them, eyes wide and fixed on Atlas, as if he were watching a language lesson no classroom could teach. Rosie Pike sat at rail height, blanket bunched in both fists, her father's unit patch laid carefully across her lap like a small flag. Her mother crouched beside the wheelchair now, one arm around Rosie's shoulders, the other hand palm out toward Atlas, fingers relaxed, showing comfort without command. Tears had drawn two clear tracks down Rosie's cheeks, but she was no longer pleading out loud. She watched the dog with an intensity beyond her years, breathing when he breathed, freezing when he froze, matching him in fragile, stubborn cadence. Atlas lay with his chest low and his weight anchored forward, paws spread for stability, ears pinned but not tucked, eyes locked uphill toward the tomb axis. Grief had drawn him into a posture that looked like obedience to anyone who did not understand it, and looked like vigil to anyone who did. His coat was thick along the neck, darker at the spine, dusted pale at the flanks where he had slipped rails and fought handlers without aggression, but with absolute refusal. Every few breaths, his nose quivered toward the wind from the headstones, searching for the scent memory that had become his compass. The bowl near him remained untouched. The ration bar had melted at the edge in the heat. By 07:12, more witnesses had drifted down from the plaza as word spread in hushed fragments, and the lane became a cross-section of the country. A father carrying a folded stroller under one arm, while his daughter clutched his sleeve. An elderly couple with matching veteran pins and wedding bands worn thin. A middle-aged groundskeeper in mud-stained boots standing shoulder to shoulder with a suited museum donor. Both men silent, both men uncovered. The specialist's cheek settled against the dart gun stock, then lifted again by a fraction. His uncertainty was visible in the tiny corrections of his elbows. Price stood close enough to be in the specialist's peripheral vision. One polished shoe pointed at Atlas, one at Volkov as if he could split command by angle alone. The credential on his chest swung once when he shifted his weight. He looked immaculate, expensive, pressed for television optics, and profoundly out of place in a moment that answered to older authorities than contracts. A ranger near the rear barrier spoke into his radio without taking his eyes off the lane. A military police cruiser rolled into the outer access road and stopped short of the crowd funnel, waiting for explicit direction to avoid turning pressure into panic. An operations clerk arrived with a clipboard hugged to her chest, sweat at her temples, and tucked herself behind the staff sergeant, ready to record every order spoken from this point forward. No one shouted. No one rushed. The restraint itself carried force. Volkov's internal clock counted in disciplined intervals, wind drift from right to left, 8 feet from muzzle to primary impact point, child at 11 o'clock, within sudden motion radius if Atlas startled, concrete glare reducing specialist depth perception, contractor verbal pressure, increasing motor error risk. Atlas in escalating sympathetic response, but still reachable through learned signal pathways. Inwardly, every combat circuit stood live. Outwardly, he remained a statue in white gloves. The old Marine tapped his cane once on the pavement and whispered, not to anyone in particular, "Hold, son." Volkov heard him. He did not answer. Then memory rose not as distraction, but as reinforcement, because this was the same edge he had stood on in different uniforms under different skies, where one hurried decision could turn a hard day into a permanent wound. He had been 21 on his first Afghanistan tour, attached to an infantry element running route clearance and village support in Coast Province, a place of jagged ridgelines and dust that entered lungs and weapon actions alike, where mornings began with rotor thunder and ended with radios crackling, names no one wanted to hear. He learned quickly that fear had a scent, that silence in a market could mean respect or danger depending on who noticed it first, and that dogs often registered shifts in threat pattern before optics or satellites ever did. His second tour pushed south into Helmand corridors where roads were suggestions and every culvert held argument. By then he had become the soldier teams called when they needed calm translated across species under pressure. He did not romanticize it. It was work paid for in fatigue, discipline, and luck. Syria came later, harder in different ways, full of urban fractures and compressed timelines where intelligence aged by the hour. During a night movement outside a shattered industrial district, a vehicle ahead took impact and rolled into a drainage cut. Volkov was in the trailing truck when the convoy halted. He went down the embankment with two others under sporadic small arms fire, hauled one gunner clear through twisted frame, then returned for a trapped driver, while fuel pooled and sparks stitched the dark. A metal edge opened a thin line along his left jaw as he braced against the door. He carried the scar back stateside, a narrow, pale reminder that survival often came measured in inches. The citation that followed carried a bronze star with valor device and language about courage under fire. Volkov accepted it, saluted, and filed it in the same private compartment as the names of men who had not stood in formation afterward. One of those names was Staff Sergeant Owen "Mac" Pike. Mac had been the loudest laugh in any platoon bay, and the steadiest hand in any bad hour, broad-shouldered, red-bearded, with a habit of calling everyone by formal rank until the first incoming rounds, then switching to first names as if reminding each man he was more than a billet. In Afghanistan, during a mortar lull that left them all grinning with adrenaline and dust-caked exhaustion, Mac had dropped onto an ammo crate, accepted a dented canteen from Volkov, and said, "If I buy it first, Volkov, make sure someone still walks post like it matters." He said it with crooked humor, like a man making light of weather, then added, "Not for me, for the kids who never get to ask why." Volkov had answered with the half-smile he rarely showed and told him to save speeches for retirement. Mac never reached retirement. The day it happened was all radio fragments and disciplined motion afterward. Contact report, medevac grid, perimeter set, casualty confirmation, then paperwork that translated a life into fields and signatures. Volkov remembered the weight of Mac's blood-type patch in his palm when he inventoried gear. He remembered writing a letter he rewrote 4 times and still believed was inadequate. He remembered standing in dress uniform months later while Rosie, smaller then, hid behind her mother's coat during the casualty support brief and peered out only when Atlas, newly transitioned from military working service to family support placement, rested his chin on her knee. Atlas had belonged to the same ecosystem of duty as the soldiers did, though his rank existed in behavior rather than insignia. After Mac's death, the dog's world narrowed to 2 anchors: Rosie's hand and locations associated with ceremony, cadence, and command voices he trusted. He accepted food from the family, tolerated strangers when Rosie was near, and once, during a thunderstorm, refused every room in the house until Rosie brought him her father's old field jacket. Then he slept with his head on the jacket's sleeve until morning. Volkov visited when schedules allowed. Never long, always respectful. He sat at kitchen tables where folded flags lived in display cases, and family photos held both joy and absence in the same frame. Rosie would ask careful questions about why soldiers marched the same path over and over, and Volkov would tell her the truth in words she could carry. Because repetition is remembrance made visible. Because discipline is how love behaves when grief would rather collapse. Because a nation forgets quickly unless someone refuses to. When his active deployment cycle ended, he requested assignment through channels that did not promise anything. He trained harder than he had in theater. Uniforms measured to the thread, cadence perfected to fractions, ceremonial rifle manual drilled until muscle memory replaced thought. He memorized tomb history and regulations until he could recite them under sleep deprivation and noise. He learned that the badge was not an honor received. It was a vow continuously renewed. On the day he earned it, he stood alone for a minute in a quiet corridor, touched the scar at his jaw, and thought of Mac's voice in that mortar lull, joking about post and children and duty as if he had already known where the promise would land. 3 days earlier, when Mac's memorial observances drew family and former unit members to Arlington, Atlas had held together through transfer points and formal cues until taps. At the final note, Rosie had inhaled sharply, small body folding inward, and Atlas had surged from harness not in aggression, but in compulsion, tracking uphill toward the axis he associated with sentinel motion and sacred stillness. Handlers recovered him once. He returned. They recovered him again during loading. He returned again, choosing nearly the same position each time, chest to ground, head to marble line, as if watch could be maintained through orientation alone. Veterinary checks found stress, dehydration risk, and exhaustion, but no rage. His behavior was grief translated into mission. Now, at Gate 2, with a dart lane opening and a child watching, Volkov carried all of that in silence. He did not need to narrate it to the crowd. His stillness narrated it for him. The specialist's breathing went audible. Price said, "Now." Volkov kept his gaze on Atlas and spoke in a low, formal cadence that carried farther than shouting. "He is marking his fallen. Give me 10 seconds." The staff sergeant looked toward the approaching command vehicle, then back to Volkov, measuring trust against policy under a narrowing clock. Around them, Arlington held its breath. Marble above, asphalt below, a sacred geometry stretched across one decision point where memory, protocol, and mercy were about to be tested in full view of the nation. Price had built an entire career on arriving at moments like this with polished certainty and leaving with camera angles that favored his clients. He was not military, not federal command, not law enforcement, but he had learned how power clustered around urgency, and he had turned that lesson into contracts so large that agencies tolerated his tone if he kept ceremonies on time and disruptions off broadcast feeds. His resume was a parade of critical event stabilization, narrative risk mitigation, and operational cleanliness. In practice, it meant he treated grief as a variable, families as logistics, and anyone in his way as expendable friction. He had come up through private security consulting after a brief career in municipal event planning, where he discovered quickly that the people who wrote reports controlled the memory of what happened. Price mastered language first. Delays became threat vectors. Mourning processions became pedestrian congestion. Veterans who objected became stakeholders requiring containment. He was very good at making callousness look procedural. By 42, he wore tailored charcoal and confidence like matching armor, carried 3 encrypted phones, and billed by the hour at rates that made mid-level officials glance twice before disagreeing with him. He did not shout because he was emotional. He shouted because he had been rewarded for it. At Gate 2, that reward system met a boundary it did not understand. The staff sergeant held his line and did not blink. The specialist kept the dart gun raised, but still had not taken the shot. Volkov remained fixed, eyes on Atlas, body angled just enough to reduce lane access. Rosie's mother stayed crouched by the wheelchair, whispering breath counts to her daughter. The old Marine stood like a weathered post at the rail, cane planted, jaw set. Every witness had gone quiet enough to hear Price's watch tick when he lifted his wrist. Price gave a cold smile that showed no warmth and very little patience. 10 seconds, he said to Volkov. You don't set the clock. I do. Volkov did not turn toward him. Request stands. Denied. Price snapped his fingers toward the specialist. Fire on 2. The specialist swallowed. Sir, I still don't have veterinary presence at point of action. Price stepped closer and lowered his voice into a blade. You have me. You have schedule pressure. You have a direct order. The ranger with the printed incident sheet moved half a step forward. You do not issue direct orders inside Arlington Command Space. Price pivoted on him with contempt sharpened for an audience. Then call whoever signs your paycheck and explain why a stray has priority over federal movement. Atlas's ears flattened tighter. His ribs fluttered faster. Volkov spoke again, calm enough to draw every eye. He is not a stray. Price looked at him now, really looked, and made the fatal read in real time. He saw the ceremonial coat, the kepi, the white gloves, the controlled posture, and interpreted all of it as decorative authority. To Price, soldiers who marched at monuments were symbols, not operators. They were there for photographs and public reassurance, not hard decisions in kinetic space. He had no framework for the possibility that the man in immaculate dress had spent years making life-and-death calls under fire and could map this lane faster than any contractor in polished shoes. Listen to me, toy soldier, Price said, voice carrying across concrete. You are blocking incident response. Step aside. A hiss of outrage moved through the crowd. The retired Army nurse inhaled sharply through her nose. One of the high school boys muttered, He did not just say that, then went quiet when his friend touched his sleeve. The Gold Star mother's eyes closed once and opened with steel in them. Rosie looked from Price back to Volkov and held her father's patch tighter in her lap. Volkov's face did not change. Address me by rank or not at all. Price laughed once, humorless and brief. You haven't earned rank in this lane. The old Marine answered from the barricade before anyone else could. He earned it where you never stood. Price ignored him and lifted his hand in a chopping motion. 2 minutes to convoy entry. I am done negotiating with spectators. By 0713, the command vehicle had reached the outer service turn, but not yet the gate itself, blocked behind a maintenance cart and a knot of rerouted visitors who had nowhere to clear without direction. Radios crackled with clipped updates, each transmission adding pressure and no immediate relief. The staff sergeant clocked the distance, then clocked Atlas's breathing, then looked at Volkov with the kind of measured trust that came from years in uniform and one bad decision too many witnessed in other hands. Sergeant, he said quietly, what happens if he takes the shot? Volkov answered without hesitation. Panic surge. Possible flight into crowd. Child exposure high. Secondary injuries likely. Price heard every word and shook his head like he was correcting a junior analyst. That is speculative fiction. It is field assessment, Volkov said. From a parade detail. From the rear of the crowd, the young amputee soldier raised his voice, controlled but firm. He said field assessment. You should listen. Price turned toward that voice and saw the pinned sleeve, the service posture. The cap held its sternum level. For one beat, uncertainty touched his expression. Then ego hardened over it again. This is not a town hall, he said. Stand back. The specialist shifted his feet and finally spoke to Volkov directly. If I hold, I get written up. If I fire, and this goes bad, I carry it. Volkov kept his gaze on Atlas. Then hold. On whose authority? Mine. Price barked. You have none. Staff Sergeant cut in like a snapped cable. He has mine until command arrives. That line changed the lane. Not the legal framework yet, not the final ruling, but the moral geometry. The crowd heard it and settled into a deeper silence, not passive now but braced. Witnesses squared their shoulders. Phones stayed down. No one wanted spectacle anymore. They wanted the right call. Atlas gave a low whine that never rose to a bark, a sound torn thin by strain. Rosie leaned forward in her wheelchair, hand trembling through the lower gap. Atlas, she whispered, voice raw. Stay with me. The dog's tail moved once. His paws flexed against pavement and stopped. Volkov tracked the microsignals in disciplined sequence. Nostril flare widening, eye whites showing at the rear corners. Foreleg tremor spreading to shoulder. Breath cadence shortening into stacked pulls. He measured wind drift, considered the dart arc, and recalculated his own movement pathway if he had to break static position. To the crowd, he looked carved from granite. Inside, every nerve ran hot and exact. Combat had taught him this paradox years earlier. The body could be ready to explode into motion, while the face stayed neutral enough to reassure everyone else. He cataloged exits. Left funnel jammed by stroller cluster and cane traffic. Right lane partially clear if the barricade pin could be lifted in one motion. Service gate behind the specialist. Locked but keyed from ranger belt at 3 o'clock. Medical bag on concrete near shuttle tire. 30 inches from Rosie's wheel. He noted each fact, assigned probability, discarded bad options, retained 3 viable pathways. His heartbeat remained even. His palms stayed dry. Training did not remove fear. It made fear useful. Price lifted his chin toward the specialist. Final instruction. Fire now. The specialist did not fire. Seconds stretched into an ugly public stalemate. A camera crew at the far sidewalk, originally staged for the diplomatic convoy, had drifted closer and now stood behind the last barricade with lenses down at their sides, uncertain whether they were allowed to document what was happening. The operations clerk noticed them and wrote a notation without looking up. Media present, no interference, witness count rising. Volkov made a decision and spoke to the staff sergeant without moving his head. If I ask for corridor clearance, can you give it? 3 feet, maybe 4. Need 6. Then make them trust you. Volkov drew one slow breath, then projected just enough to reach the front rail. No sudden movement, no raised voices. Keep children behind wheels. Open center, line on my command. The response was immediate and organic. The father with the folded stroller moved left and pulled his daughter gently behind his leg. The high school boys stepped back and guided 2 younger kids with them. The old Marine planted his cane farther out, creating a visible boundary. Rosie's mother touched her daughter's shoulder and eased the wheelchair 2 inches rearward, without breaking eye contact with Atlas. The crowd had become an impromptu formation, under one calm instruction. Price stared at them in disbelief. You're taking orders from him? The retired Army nurse answered, eyes on Atlas. We're taking responsibility. At 0714, another radio burst cut through the lane. Command 1 minute out. Hold all chemical actions. Repeat. Hold all chemical actions. Price jabbed a finger at the staff sergeant. You are about to own a diplomatic delay because of an animal. The staff sergeant replied, I will own a safe lane. That is all? Price's jaw tightened until a tendon stood out near his ear. He switched tactics, voice going smooth and venomous. Sergeant Volkov, step aside voluntarily, and I keep this administrative. Keep obstructing, and I file formal misconduct before noon. Volkov finally turned his eyes to Price, and the look was not anger. It was colder than anger, the expression of a man who had buried friends and no longer confused paperwork with consequence. File what you need. Price opened his mouth to answer, but the words were drowned by Atlas's breathing hitching into a sharper rhythm. The dog's head dipped, rose, dipped again, and his hindquarters tensed, as if the body might bolt in any direction if one more stressor landed wrong. Rosie made a soft sound of panic and reached farther through the rail. Volkov shifted his weight one fraction forward. Every muscle coiled. He could feel the concrete through his soles, the wind pressure on his left cheek, the exact distance between his knee and the dart lane, the time it would take to close it. He remembered Mac's voice on that ammo crate, joking through dust and incoming rounds, telling him to walk post like it mattered. He remembered Rosie at a kitchen table, asking why repetition mattered when people forgot. He remembered Atlas resting his head on an old field jacket during a storm and refusing sleep until duty scent was near. Price saw the shift and mistook it for compliance. That's better, he said, almost relieved. Move. Volkov did not move away. He moved intention into readiness. The specialist's trigger finger tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. Sweat slid from his temple to his jaw. The dart muzzle tracked a wavering line toward Atlas's shoulder, then toward Volkov's chest line, then back. One bad tremor now would write a permanent record in flesh and memory. From uphill came the rising growl of a command engine, clearing the final bend. From the rail came Rosie's whisper, fractured but steady. Please. From the center of the lane came Volkov's final warning, low and formal, carrying to every corner of the gate. Weapon down. Price answered with a single word. No. The crowd froze into absolute stillness as Volkov locked onto the next half-second, the one where training, grief, authority, and mercy would collide, and the nation watching would learn which kind of power could stand in sacred ground without breaking it. The half-second broke. Volkov moved first, not fast in the way panic moved, fast in the way training moved when it had already solved the geometry. His left boot drove forward. His shoulders turned. His body crossed the dart lane and sealed it with deliberate mass. In the same motion, he stripped off his right white glove and let it fall to the concrete. Like a dropped flag of truce, he no longer had the luxury to offer. Then he lowered to one knee between Atlas and the muzzle, spine upright, jaw set, one bare hand open against his own chest, where old commands lived in muscle memory. The specialist jerked the barrel up by instinct, startled by the sudden human wall in his sight line. He did not fire. The crowd inhaled as one body. No one exhaled. Price snapped, "Oh, what are you doing?" Volkov never looked back at him. His voice came out level and iron-flat, the kind of calm that turned noise into silence. Stand down. This sentinel is on watch for his fallen. The words landed across asphalt and marble and radios alike. They were not loud. They did not need to be. The lane went still under them. Atlas's breathing stuttered once, twice, then held in a high, trembling pause. Volkov kept his palm pressed to his own sternum. and gave a small two-tap signal with his fingertips, then a closed fist, then open hand again, the old K9 settle sequence Mac had used after blast noise, the one Rosie had watched him practice in living rooms and hallways during the first raw months after the casualty officers left. For a fraction of a second, Atlas did not respond, eyes wide, ears pinned, body strung tight as cable. Volkov repeated the signal without changing tempo. Tap, tap, fist, open. The dog's head dipped, his shoulders dropped a measurable inch. One forepaw unclenched, his breathing lengthened from stacked pulls into ragged but deeper draws. The whine in his throat faded to a low vibration, and then disappeared. A stunned murmur rolled through the witnesses like wind through dry leaves. The old Marine closed his eyes and whispered, "There it is." Rosie covered her mouth with both hands, tears still on her cheeks, and nodded hard as if she had been waiting for that exact rhythm all morning. Price stepped toward Volkov, fury overtaking calculation. "Get up. You are interfering with a federal operation." Volkov turned his head just enough for Price to hear him and no one else to mistake him. "Your operation nearly broke a mourning partner in front of his child." That one sentence froze Price harder than shouting could have. For the first time, he looked less certain, because the crowd had already chosen which language it trusted, invoice language or duty language. By 07:15, the command engine reached the final barrier and braked. Military police dismounted in controlled sequence, no weapons raised, creating space with open palms and clear verbal lanes. Behind them came Brigadier General Miriam Hale in service uniform, cap tucked under one arm, Arlington command staff at her shoulder, expression composed and unambiguous. She moved through the parted line of witnesses without hurry and without wasted motion, the way senior officers moved when they expected instant compliance before they said a word. She took in the scene in one sweep. Volkov kneeling bare-handed in the dart lane, white glove on concrete. Atlas settled but exhausted. Rosie at the rail, specialist still shouldering an unfired dart gun. Price standing in polished shoes with authority leaking out of him. "Safety on that launcher," Hale said. The specialist clicked the safety and lowered the barrel at once. "Set it down." He set it on the pavement and stepped back with visible relief. Hale stopped 3 feet from Volkov. "Sergeant Volkov, report." Volkov rose from one knee in a single controlled motion, still between Atlas and any threat vector. "Ma'am." Subject Atlas displayed acute bereavement stress in fixed duty posture, non-aggressive. Chemical restraint risked panic flight into a compressed civilian lane, with child exposure and secondary injury, probability high. Contractor attempted forced sedation without Arlington command authorization. I intervened to preserve safety and dignity of ongoing memorial observance. Hale's eyes moved to Atlas, then to Rosie's patch on her lap, then back to Volkov. "Assessment basis? K9 combat support training, 2 Afghanistan tours, 1 Syria deployment, post-service bereavement handling with this family, ma'am. Recommendation: immediate Vigil exception with veterinary supervision, controlled hydration, quiet perimeter, child access maintained, no chemical action unless veterinary officer deems imminent medical necessity." Hale gave one short nod. "Approved." The word hit the lane like a gavel. Price found his voice again. "General, with respect, my office has primary transit authority on this corridor. We have a diplomatic convoy." Hale turned to him, and the temperature of the moment dropped 10 degrees. "Identify yourself for the record." "Nolan Price, Lead Crisis Manager, Federal Contract Operations." "Contract number." Price hesitated, then recited it. The operations clerk wrote it down without looking up. Hale held out her hand. "Credential." Price did not move for a beat. Then he unclipped the badge wallet and passed it over. Hale examined it, then handed it to the provost marshal captain at her right. Suspend this credential pending immediate review for unsafe escalation, unauthorized clinical coercion, and interference with Arlington Command Control. Price stared at her. You can't suspend me on sight. I just did. General, this is career ending over a dog. Hale's reply came clean and public, pitched for every camera and every veteran ear in the lane. This is not about a dog. This is about a fallen soldier's family, a military partner in grief, and your decision to force chemical restraint inside a crowded memorial corridor after explicit hold orders. You confused access with command. A low sound moved through the crowd, not cheering, not celebration, something deeper. Recognition that the right authority had finally arrived and spoken plain truth. Hale looked to the operations clerk. Log time 0716. Note, verbal hold from dispatch was active and disregarded by contractor. Attach Ranger incident sheet, body cam references, and witness list. The clerk answered, Logged, ma'am. The Ranger with the printed sheet stepped forward and handed it over. Hale read the top lines, then passed it to her legal officer. Chain this with dispatch audio and medical advisories. No gaps. Yes, ma'am. She turned to the staff sergeant. Who requested command presence? Gate 2 operations, ma'am. Good call. Then she faced the military police detail. Escort Mr. Price to the outer gate. He is removed from this incident footprint and from Arlington-controlled operations pending review. He is not to approach the family, the animal, or ceremonial routes. One MP gestured. Sir, with us. Price did not move. You're making a spectacle. Hale held his gaze. You made one when you tried to sedate grief on a countdown. For the first time all morning, Price had no line ready. He looked around as if searching for an ally and found only witnesses. The nurse with arms folded, the amputee soldier standing tall, the high school boys watching with hard young faces, the old Marine rigid as fence post, Rosie clutching her patch, Atlas steady at Volkov's boot. Cameras were up now, but no one rushed forward. The silence itself escorted him. The MPs guided him toward the service road. His polished shoes clicked once, then scraped against the loose grit at the curb. He kept his chin up, but the posture had changed. The certainty was gone. Its outcome was decided in this lane before he reached the gate. Hale shifted immediately from consequence to care. Veterinary team. A captain in medical insignia stepped in with 2 technicians carrying fluid kits and a cooling mat. They approached Atlas from the side with practiced restraint, pausing until Volkov gave a slight nod and Rosie whispered the dog's name. Atlas watched them, then settled his chin to pavement again, eyes still trained uphill toward the tomb axis. Hydration first, the captain said softly. No sedation. We keep him calm. We keep him oriented. Rosie's mother looked up at Hale, voice unsteady but clear. Ma'am, can she sit with him? Hale answered without hesitation. Yes. Controlled access. Wheel her in when the medic clears space. The old Marine removed his cap entirely and pressed it to his chest. The Gold Star mother unfolded her program and, with careful hands, fanned air toward Atlas, while the technicians worked. One of the high school boys asked a ranger, almost in a whisper, Can we help hold the shade tarp? The ranger nodded, and within seconds, 2 teens who had arrived as spectators were bracing poles over the lane to cut the rising sun. Hale turned back to Volkov. Sergeant, you broke ceremonial line to intervene. Yes, ma'am. Do you stand by that choice? Volkov's answer came the same way his marching cadence came, measured, exact, without ornament. I do, ma'am. Hale held his eyes for one beat, then inclined her head. So do I. On record. The staff sergeant exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. The specialist, who had held the dart gun, sank onto an upturned crate at the edge of the lane, hands shaking now that he was allowed to feel them shake. A technician took his statement quietly, adding it to the running log. Hale addressed the assembled witnesses, voice carrying with command without becoming theatrical. This corridor remains under Arlington control. The family's mourning period is recognized. A 3-day vigil exception is now in effect under veterinary supervision and safety perimeter protocol. You will have room to observe, but you will keep silence and follow ranger directions. We honor the fallen by how we treat the living who carry them. Heads nodded across every demographic at once. Rosie's wheelchair rolled forward when the medics signaled clear. She reached down with a small, trembling hand and touched Atlas behind the ear. The dog released a long breath and closed his eyes halfway, still facing the marble line, still on watch in the only way he knew. Volkov bent, retrieved his fallen white glove, and brushed a faint line of grit from the fingertips. He put it back on with deliberate care, finger by finger, sealing discipline back into place after the single, necessary breach. Then he looked to Hale for final instruction. "Return to post, Sergeant," she said. He saluted. "Yes, ma'am." As he turned uphill toward the tomb, boots striking concrete in steady cadence, the crowd parted without being asked. No applause rose. No one broke the silence with chatter. They had witnessed the decisive line and the validating authority, and they understood they were standing inside a place where honor was not a slogan, but a practice standard, enforced in real time, carried by those who remembered what sacrifice cost. He climbed the grade toward the plaza with the same controlled cadence he had carried on deployment roads and marble mats, and the crowd opened for him in a clean corridor of silence. Veterans and tourists and teenagers stepping back shoulder to shoulder, as if they had rehearsed it. Behind him, Gate 2 remained busy with medics and military police, but ahead of him the white stone of Arlington drew the eye back to first principles: duty, order, remembrance. At the top approach, the relief sentinel waiting near the mat gave him one hard look that held a full conversation and no spoken word. Volkov answered with a fractional nod, took his assigned position, and on command returned to the measured arc before the tomb. His boots clicked onto stone. The sound cut through the morning residue of adrenaline and reset the world by inches. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. Below the plaza line, the flag moved in a steady wind. Rows of white headstones stood in disciplined ranks down the hill, each one catching the late morning sun along its edge. The marble face of the tomb held its own cool light, unchanged by contractors, cameras, or ego. Volkov's expression returned to its unreadable stillness. Face carved from discipline, eyes locked on a point only he could see, but inside he tracked every periphery cue as rigorously as before. Crowd spacing, slope glare, ranger signals, the gait of a man on a cane, the position of a child near rail height. At Gate 2, Brigadier General Hale remained in command posture and moved the aftermath from chaos to record. The dart launcher was cleared, chamber checked, serial logged, then sealed in an evidence pouch by the provost marshal captain. The tranquilizer cartridge, still unfired, went into a separate tamper bag with chain of custody signatures from the specialist, the ranger, and the operations clerk. Price's credential wallet was photographed, tagged, and transferred to Arlington legal custody, pending contract review. The ranger's printed incident sheet that had been waved aside minutes earlier was now clipped at the top of the official packet, followed by dispatch transcript excerpts, body camera pull requests, and a handwritten witness cue in block letters. "Read back. Hold order timestamps," Hale said. The operations clerk checked her notes. "First, verbal hold at 0709. Repeat hold at 0714. Contractor acknowledgement captured on body cam." "Good. Attach both." The legal officer took the packet. "Ma'am, contracting office has requested a same-day summary. Send it by 1100. Include that sedation authority was never delegated." "Yes, ma'am." Atlas lay on the cooling mat, still oriented toward the tomb axis, but his breath had settled into slower draws. A veterinary captain knelt with 2 fingers at his flank, counting respiration, then lifted a pouch of fluids and nodded to Rosie. "You can give him water now, little by little." Rosie held the collapsible bowl with both hands while her mother steadied her wrist. Atlas drank, paused and drank again, eyes half-lidded but fixed uphill. The old Marine with the cane stood just outside the perimeter and watched with wet eyes he did not hide. The retired Army nurse gave her witness statement in calm, precise sentences, then stayed to help direct foot traffic away from the medics without being asked. By 10:30, the heat had softened and the lane had become orderly again. The maintenance cart that had blocked the command engine earlier was moved, documented, and noted as the delay point in the timeline. The ranger who had twice tapped his earpiece in the plaza gave his statement to military police. The first tap had been the initial alert that a bereavement K-9 had slipped harness. The second had been confirmation that crowd pressure at the gate required rerouting before panic set in. The strange current that had rippled through perimeter staff at dawn was no mystery now. It had been an early, disciplined response to keep the tomb approach calm while the emergency formed downhill. Near noon, Hale received a call on secure line at the operations table, listened without interruption, then answered in clipped cadence. "Understood? Effective immediately?" A beat. "Copy. Send written confirmation to Arlington Command and Provost." She ended the call and turned to her legal officer. "Contracting suspended Nolan Price's site authority across all cemetery-controlled lanes, pending full investigation. Interim replacement arrives tomorrow. Note that in the incident closure report." The operations clerk wrote the line exactly. Nothing in the paperwork restored what grief had taken from the Pike family. But the record mattered. At Arlington, memory was moral labor, and documentation was one way institutions kept faith. At 12:40, when Volkov rotated through a scheduled relief window, he stepped off the mat and into the shaded side corridor for exactly the minutes authorized. A junior sentinel handed him a fresh pair of gloves, though his own were serviceable. Volkov looked at the right glove he had dropped in the lane. A faint trace of concrete dust remained in a seam. He cleaned it with a care cloth, slow strokes, no rush, then placed it back with his gear. The glove was accounted for, not discarded, a small white artifact of the one protocol breach that had preserved a larger protocol. The dignity of the fallen and the living who carried them. Hale met him at the corridor threshold, accompanied by the staff sergeant from Gate 2. "Sergeant Volkov," she said, voice low enough to keep the space respectful, "your intervention is entered as justified emergency action under Arlington Command Authority. No adverse finding." "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze. "Price's removal is effective. Dispatch and body cam review corroborate your assessment. The family's 3-day vigil exception is signed and active through sunset on day 3. Veterinary supervision continuous." "Understood, ma'am," the staff sergeant added. "Rosie asked if Atlas can hear your steps from down there." Volkov's jaw tightened by a fraction, the only visible sign anything moved beneath the stone. "He can." Hale gave one nod and stepped aside. "Return to duty." He did. All afternoon, the witness line changed faces, but kept the same tone. Tour buses came and went. School groups rotated. A father explained to his son why hats came off here. Two teenagers who had helped hold the shade tarp at Gate 2 returned in clean shirts and stood still through 3 full cycles, phones in pockets. The Gold Star mother remained for an hour at the rope, then pressed her folded program flat and tucked it into her coat like a letter she intended to keep. At 1700, clouds moved in thin bands over the cemetery, softening the sun into a pale wash that made the marble glow. A breeze carried cut grass, stone dust, and distant trumpet warm-ups for evening ceremonies. Down the slope at the controlled vigil zone, Atlas rose with effort, took a slow turn, then lay again facing the same line uphill. He had accepted fluids, a small ration portion, and veterinary touch. He accepted none of it until Rosie had touched his shoulder first. When sunset neared, rangers opened a narrow access lane and rolled Rosie's wheelchair to a designated point where she could see both Atlas and the tomb without crowd pressure. Her mother stood behind her, one hand on the chair, one hand over her own heart. The old Marine took position to their right, cane planted, cap removed. The young amputee soldier stood to their left, posture straight, eyes forward. Behind them, civilians who had arrived for an ordinary visit found themselves standing uncovered in full silence, drawn into a ceremony they had not expected but understood at once. Taps began. The first notes floated over the slope and hung in the cooling air, clear and spare. No one spoke. Atlas lowered his head to his paws and stilled completely, ears angled toward the sound, body finally at rest without surrendering his orientation to the marble above. Rosie reached down and laid her palm between his shoulders. Small fingers spread against dark fur and held it there through the final note. Up at the tomb, Volkov moved through his cadence as daylight thinned. 21 steps. Pause. Turn. Repeat. On his next pass, he reached the turn point and held the pause a heartbeat longer. Not a break in regulation, only the full value of it. His eyes, unreadable to almost everyone, shifted just enough to find Rosie at the lower line. She sat very straight in her wheelchair, chin lifted, her father's unit patch resting flat against her chest. She raised 2 fingers in a small, careful salute she had practiced in living room mirrors and hospital corridors and cemetery paths. Volkov returned to motion without visible flourish, but Rosie saw it. The tiniest incline of his chin at the start of his next step, acknowledgement within discipline. The old Marine leaned toward her and whispered, "Your dad would be proud." Rosie did not look away from the mat. "He told me soldiers keep promises with their feet." "They do," the Marine said. As the final light drained from the marble, and the headstones turned from white to silver gray, Hale stood at the edge of the plaza with her cap under her arm and watched the line hold. The operations clerk closed the incident packet, now complete with the witness statements, chain of custody signatures, dispatch logs and command directives, and walked it to legal intake before the office lights came on. The ranger who had tapped his earpiece at dawn signed his last line and initialed the margin. The tranquilizer specialist, statement filed, removed his company patch and placed it in his pocket. Eyes on the ground, lesson learned without theatrics. No one who had stood at Gate 2 that morning left unchanged. Night settled over Arlington in deliberate gradients. The flag lowered, the wind eased. The crowd thinned to those who understood why staying mattered. Volkov kept walking, boots on stone, marble in shadow, rows of white markers standing silent and exact beyond the rail. Atlas quiet at vigil beside Rosie's hand. The tomb at the center, not as monument alone, but as vow made visible. In that final image, Sacred order did not arrive through noise or purchase. It endured through discipline, witness, and the hard, unadorned truth that honor could never be bought, only carried. At sunset on day 3, with veterinary staff and the ranger log present, Atlas finally rose from the vigil mat, held the tomb line for one long breath, then turned from the axis on his own. Rosie touched behind his ear, and he leaned into her hand before stepping beside her chair. From the upper walk, Volkov marked the movement without breaking cadence. As Atlas left Gate 2 calmly with the Pike family, Rosie looked up once. Volkov's fractional nod answered. The vigil was complete.